So hello everybody. If you are a climate change skeptic, that's absolutely fine. This isn't actually a kind of political agenda. I'm not kind of trying to get everyone to be on the same page, but just if you can obviously just hear what I have to say. I'm sure many surveyors will have a few thoughts about what I've got to say, good or bad, always happy to hear, so please do let me know. So, okay, also just a word of warning, so I tend to get somewhat passionate. When I was practicing this last night, I got told by the person that I live with that I sounded very angry at one point. So apologies if that comes across. Just a natural way of being, clearly. So for everyone, just as an intro to me, so my name's Kate Charrington, and I set up a company called Project 3 back in 2020. Which is essentially a residential surveying consultancy. And I help residential surveyors specifically improve their home survey reports in terms of not just meeting standards and being compliant with home survey standards or whichever standard you comply with, but also provide high quality reports as well. So today I'm actually going to show you just very kind of small changes that you can make to your home surveys, which will hopefully have a very big impact. Hi Wayne. Wayne's probably heard some of these things before, so sorry Wayne in advance. So in terms of how I'm going to do it, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a kind of rundown, if you will, as to why we as residential surveyors actually need to do that. I appreciate some of you are not residential surveyors, so apologies for that. Sorry to the electricians in the room or any engineers as well, but hopefully some of it may actually be either informative or just get you to perhaps think a little bit differently. But once I've kind of explain the why, what I'll show you are a few kind of basic examples that I start with clients to get them to really kind of shift the way that their surveys are delivered so that their services actually remain relevant and resilient as well. So before I start, so I'm a chartered surveyor. My experience is purely in residential work, so home survey and valuation work in particular. I'm also a qualified retrofit coordinator and trained climate reality leader, and I've also written some of the sustainability and retrofit modules for residential survey and valuation diplomas. But something that I don't profess to be is either an environmental or net zero expert. And I'm sure that actually many of you will probably have a lot deeper of an understanding about some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today than perhaps I do. And that's absolutely fine. So like JJ said, if you've got any comments, any questions, any queries, please do feel free to discuss. But whilst I wouldn't necessarily kind of designate myself as the kind of environmental or net zero expert, what I have been doing over the last 4 years is reviewing home survey reports. So as a result of that, I feel like I've got a pretty good idea of not just how home surveys actually compare with each other, but also actually what might elevate them in terms of the content, in terms of the material, and essentially what makes one home survey actually different from essentially your bog standard survey. And really the focus today is obviously talking about climate change and how we can actually introduce some of those elements into our home surveys. I've got a very dry throat, people, when I talk, so apologies if I keep drinking. So you guys probably already know that climate change is happening, okay? Whether you like it or not, or whether you kind of are a climate change skeptic, the reality is that climate has always changed and it will always continue to do so, regardless of how much impact you think that humans and the Industrial Revolution has actually had on that. And so you probably know as a result that climate change is having an impact on the world that we live in, but it's also having an impact on us as professionals as well. particularly because if we think about extreme weather events, the impact of climate change on residential property is going to be more and more in the future, not just from an environmental perspective, but also from a regulation, from a legislation, and a financial perspective as well. But something that you probably don't know, because maybe some of you have never spoken to me before, is that given my kind of 4 years experience of reviewing home survey reports, only a handful of surveyors, and I truly mean a handful, actually mention climate or climate change in their home survey reports. And that's even when we're actually talking about a level 3 RICS equivalent. And that to me is a huge mistake, not just generally speaking, but actually I'm going to say in my view, but it's not necessarily a view, it actually contravenes the home survey standard as well. And I want to explain why. So if we think about climate change, that is essentially a shift in the kind of typical or average weather pattern within a particular region or area. Now, who here kind of lives in certain localities which may be coastal, which may have seen kind of climate change issues? Anybody? Okay, cool. So there's a lot actually been happening recently, particularly around Norfolk area. I think issues with kind of councils and how they're actually dealing with that. But also recently there was a report that came out using government data that essentially said that there are 21 hamlets and villages within England alone that are essentially going to lose £500 million worth of residential property by the year 2100 as a result of coastal erosion. So, you know, we tend to, when we think about climate change, a lot of us might think about the Sundarbans, we might think about Pacific Islands, you know, but the reality is that it's not just a global problem. Things are happening in the UK as well, whether that be coastal erosion, whether that be flooding, whether that be heat, storm issues, what have you. So the reason why that's important is because we actually need to understand what's going on around us to actually then be better able to report and advise clients appropriately. So just to give you a few facts and figures, which, yeah, pretty stark. So this week, the Association of British Insurers actually came out and said that weather-related damage insurance claims had actually increased by 36% from 2022. And the reason for that is obviously weather-related. Something kind of specific to me. So back in January 2022, my mother-in-law, she was in the process of selling her house. She was going to buy a new build property. During that kind of early February, I think it was, Storm Eunice hit, and it took off her entire dormer flat roof, literally ripped it off, threw it down the road, and she broke a few, I say she, but the flat roof actually broke a few greenhouses of neighbours along the way. That claim that she put in was almost £5,000 worth, and the weather-related damage kind of caused and the insurance claims made in that particular year. I think some of them haven't actually been settled yet, but it's round about £573 million worth. So it's a lot of money when it comes to obviously insurance claims payout on the basis of weather. Additionally to that, when we think about storms, we kind of think about the initial impact. But you know, when we think about storms as well, what actually comes after that can often be things like flash flooding. And in terms of the kind of post-storm impacts of weather-related damage on property, in terms of the insurance claims, they actually account for around 50%. So again, the Association of British Insurers have said that actually it's equating to around £286 million for that kind of post-storm weather impacts on property in particular. So just to give you a little bit of context in terms of the UK and storms, so since kind of September 2023, we've actually had 11 named storms. Named storms are actually primarily named because of the potential that they can cause in terms of disruption, in terms of damage, based on usually and typically wind forces, but actually it can be as a result of the impacts of rain and snow as well. So you might have a named storm for various reasons, but we had Storm Agnes back in 2023, because that's when usually the rotation of named storms happens, is from September onwards. And then most recently we've had Storm Kathleen this April. So we really are, from what I see, we're actually really missing out on opportunities to better advise clients as to why, you know, maintenance of property in particular is becoming increasingly important to combat in terms of the impact of climate change on property, and what that might actually do in terms of damage caused by these kind of weather events in particular. If we kind of think beyond just storms, temperature. Who here felt really, really hot at some point in the last 5 years? Right? Super, super hot. Okay, so anyone here live in Lincolnshire? Or thereabouts? Somewhere in the Midlands or North? My mum likes to think it's North, but actually it's supposedly classed as Midlands. But so they recorded 40.3 degrees back in 2022. Okay, if you think that's Lincolnshire, right? That's not even south. So that's really, really quite stark. And then additionally to that, what I've found quite interesting actually is that in September last year alone, we actually saw 7 consecutive running days of where we saw temperatures reach 30 degrees or above in the UK. Now you might say, well, actually, that doesn't sound too bad. The reality is that, remember, that's actually within the month of September itself. It's not kind of peak summer months. So in terms of how we think about that, maybe we are seeing that kind of shift in terms of weather patterns, and particularly seasons as well. I mean, I personally don't know about you guys, but it seems to me that the seasonal changes are becoming much less distinct than perhaps they were when I was at school. Something else. So in terms of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland as well, so we've actually had maximum temperatures recorded all within the last 5 years, so 2021 and 2022 respectively as well. So the question is, well, why does that actually matter? Well, when we talk about temperatures, in fact, you tell me, when I talk about temperature and you think about a building, what do you think about?
Insulation.
Say again, sorry?
Insulation.
So insulation? Cost? Cost of what?
Ventilation.
Okay, ventilation.
Expansion and contraction.
Exactly. So expansion and contraction. So essentially we're thinking about how the property works and how temperature impacts on maybe the manifestation of particular defects. So particularly things like cracking, as an example. But when we think about heat, remember that we are surveyors and we are delivering a report to a human person. And what we really should be thinking about is actually things like heat and humidity. There's a lot of people in the UK who, or at least in my experience, when it gets hot, everyone freaks out. They start complaining, my God, the sun's too hot, can't bear it. When it's too cold, equally the same. So it's really interesting how weather really seems to impact people's lives, particularly here in Britain. And something that I found quite interesting was the NHS back in June last year. So they recorded, in 1 week of June, I should say, to be more specific. So they recorded 1 visit every 6 seconds to the heat exhaustion advice website, as a result of obviously people feeling particularly hot. So when we're talking about heat and humidity, we really need to be thinking about vulnerable clients and people who might be elderly, as an example, because it may well actually impact them perhaps more so than someone who might be able-bodied or what have you. So with temperatures rising, there's a real opportunity actually for us to provide better information and advice to our clients, particularly when it comes to overheating. So if we consider for a second that we are surveyors of property, property is essentially there to keep clients, keep them safe, keep them sheltered, then really we have a duty to actually help tackle and combat climate change on behalf of our clients and through the very work that we actually do. So with that in mind, our role is changing, and it should change to better reflect climate and climate change within our particular reports. And I'm going to show you an example of how it's actually changing. But to start off, I'm actually going to show you how I kind of see the history of survey reporting, I guess, more generally speaking, and how that kind of really sits in terms of how we report now, currently based on what I see in terms of home surveys. So I qualified in 2013. Doesn't seem like that long ago at all, but there's certainly been some shifts in the residential kind of space relating to climate change. So can anyone think of any? No one knows of any shifts?
Reporting on energy efficiency.
So energy efficiency being one. So what specifically is important to residential surveyors in terms of reporting?
We need to comment on the EPC.
So yeah, EPC commentary. So essentially what I'm driving at is minimum energy efficiency standards. So that's kind of one thing which we've seen back in 2018. What else?
Process of delivery, pre-information, post-conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, if we think about data, there is much more accessible data to the public now. And whilst I think that's, gosh, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, I don't really want to talk about it, but I think whilst that can be a good thing, it actually puts us potentially at risk, actually, because essentially, if something is in the public space and it is publicly known, then really that is something that we should know and understand as well. So I'll get on to talking about specifically what I mean by that a little bit later on. But more generally, we've seen, rise of green technologies, an increase in things like green mortgages, the way that banks actually report against climate change risk, specifically actually relating to things like EPCs. Additionally, if we think about EPCs more generally, historically, they were actually therefore used as government data. Now they are actually being used as consumer-oriented kind of certificates for them to better understand, whether they might choose one property from another. So there's been a real shift there in terms of what an EPC means and actually how it's used, particularly throughout maybe a home buying, selling, or renting process. We've also had kind of shifts more generally in terms of the RICS, in terms of how they actually talk about sustainability, as well as people like Mark Carney, the ex-governor of Bank of England. Back in 2015, he actually delivered a speech called Tragedy of the Horizon. Has anyone listened to it? A huge recommendation for me. It really opened my eyes, certainly, to the kind of liability, physical risk, transitional risk, liability-based risk, just around climate change and what the reality might be if we don't actually face it now and actually make relevant changes. So generally speaking, the topic of climate and climate change is actually becoming much more prevalent, not just in society, but also within our professional space as well. So my question is, well, why the hell aren't surveyors talking about it then? Doesn't kind of make sense to me. And so to answer that question, I've essentially kind of put this kind of reporting mechanism, which is how I kind of view things on the slide here. So in the world of residential surveying, we often talk a lot about helping people. And I certainly know that most of my clients definitely have clients at the heart of what they do. But that doesn't necessarily translate into a client-focused report. And I think this is potentially why is that we've really had a very kind of linear approach to reporting. So essentially, go to see the property, take a look at the defects, and then we report on condition. Now, historically, there's probably been nothing wrong with that, but it definitely has its limitations in terms of the fact that we actually become so focused on the fabric of the property that we actually often forget that there's an occupant who's going to be in there at some point, whether that be because the client's actually purchasing the property to own, or whether maybe perhaps they're going to rent it out at a later date. And was anyone here at the last conference in November? Yeah, so I don't know if you remember, but there was a guy who spoke. I think his name was I know it was Justin Coke, and he was essentially talking about the training of surveyors from kind of back in the 60s and 70s right up to the modern day, and he was essentially asking the question, well, should we not be training surveyors to ensure that they're delivering for things, delivering reports which are maybe perhaps more appropriate to aspirations of the client? And I would say absolutely yes, not just because obviously clients are fundamentally who we look after, but also actually because we can then perform our obligations under the Home Survey Standard, of which I personally don't think this type of linear reporting necessarily actually allows for. So just as a really kind of basic example, if we think about a property, we go to a property, we see a broken window, might be a little bit faulty, might have faulty mechanisms, a little bit stiff or what have you. And that kind of linear approach focuses purely on the fabric. And the only reason why I see any kind of additional commentary to that is either based on things like windowsills being too low, or perhaps actually a lack of means of escape. So it's very much kind of fire and health and safety conscious, which is great, but it's very much property defect and condition without actually consideration of climate and climate change. And I'll kind of talk you through that in the next slide. But so one way that we can actually adapt our reporting is to think about the approach that we take, not just necessarily to the survey inspection, but actually what we comment on more broadly in the various elements of the home survey in all sections. Any questions? Comments, queries, or wonderings? Okay, all right. So let me just move on here. So, for example, this kind of approach essentially better serves clients, because what we're doing using this kind of approach is actually thinking much more holistically about the connections between the various components. So specifically here, I probably kind of get you to think about obviously climate, occupants, resilience. Okay, so those fundamental aspects of what we should be actually talking about to make sure that we're not just thinking about the kind of micro impacts, so i.e. just the site, only the fabric, but we're actually thinking about more of the macro elements as well. So if we think about the example of the window, if we use this particular approach, then we might actually provide more information and advice in relation to energy matters. You know, something which obviously forms part of the Home Survey Standard in particular. But also talking about things like heat loss, talking about things like overheating, which I've already mentioned. You know, these elements are, and particularly overheating, I would say, is actually classed as a risk to occupants, right? And so if we're thinking about section 4.5 of the Home Survey Standard, then really, so the standard, hopefully everyone's read the standard here, so when it comes to risk to occupants, you must describe the risk to the occupant. Okay, so it's a must, so it's an obligation on your behalf. So as a result of that, if we think about overheating, you know, we've got Building Regulation Part O. Anyone here in Part O expert? Anyone started to read it? Had a little glance? Okay. All right, so therefore, you know, that's really what we should be doing. We talk about building regulations in relation to fire safety. We talk about it in relation to loft conversions. Why are we not also talking about the, you know, principles of overheating within our home surveys as well? And so if we think about building regulation O and thinking about some of the principles there, you know, you might start talking about things like mitigating solar gains. Okay, you might start talking about removing excess heat from a property, which essentially kind of ties into ventilation and things like that as well. So from a client perspective, it's all about making sure that you're linking the various elements to better inform a client. So just as an example, so I live in a property which is north-south facing. In the summertime, the living room gets incredibly hot, and that's partly because actually the elevation is it's probably around 60% glazing. So as a result of that, you know, I'm susceptible to much more solar gain than perhaps a new build property in particular. So when we think about that, we need to make sure that our clients are forewarned and forearmed about those various things, because they are risks to occupants, particularly if you're talking about people who are vulnerable and potentially elderly as well. And also, quite frankly, in fact, how many people have bought a house relatively recently? Maybe in the last 10 years, 15 years, 20 years even, right, or ever. And the point is that you probably go around the house and you're there for 15 minutes, right? You're kind of shoved in the door by an estate agent. You're on the clock. You can see them looking at their watch. The reality is that you won't have necessarily considered stuff. Yes, the likelihood is obviously, you know, if you are surveyors, if you are engineers or whatever, you may well think about those things. But your average typical consumer and client, they're just going to go and say, oh, this is pretty, this is very nice, I wouldn't mind living here. They're not actually going to think about the practicalities and what that actually might mean for them in future. So it becomes really important that we actually start to bring aspects of that into our reports, and therefore actually be compliant with not just section 4.5, but also section 4.7 in terms of talking about deficiencies when it comes to energy efficiency measures as well. Okay, so that was it. So in terms of the home survey reports that I read as well, another example of actually how we can utilise this particular approach is based on what I see pretty much week in, week out, is around geology. So I read so many reports that basically say this property is in an area of shrinkable subsoil. Okay, that's it. That's all the information that's given. Whilst that's, you know, possibly true, and it may well be shrinkable subsoil. The only other kind of additional commentary that you tend to get in a survey is around if there are trees located nearby or if there's an issue with the drainage. Now, that's fine, but if we think about climate change generally and the fact that if we are going to see wetter winters, hotter summers, you know, what's the issue with that?
That's quite simple. My daughter bought a house when the address was Spring Vale.
Yes.
What does that mean? No one picked it up. In fact, when we had the floods in the Kingsworthy, it flooded.
Yeah, and so essentially, when we think about climate change, yes, it might flood, but actually the exacerbation of those issues will be as a result of climate change. So if we have wetter weather anyway, then actually if it's in a spring location, then it's just I hesitate to use the phrase, but it's common sense, right? It's going to impact more and become essentially a cumulative effect. The same is true of when people kind of report on flooding, which I'll talk about a little bit later and hopefully remember what I'm thinking right now. So in terms of expanding on things like geology, you know, really think about commenting on wetter winters, hotter summers, what that might actually do in terms of the impact to places where shrinkable subsoil is, and how obviously it might become a riskier prospect with climate change. I get a fair amount of knockback from surveyors, primarily because surveyors will tell me, well, we shouldn't be crystal ball gazing. Okay, we can't look into the future, we can't do this, we're doing a property as a snapshot in time and all the rest of it. I absolutely understand that context and understand that premise. However, if we're thinking, again, I'm going to kind of come back to section 4.5, risk to occupants, and in fact, just risk generally speaking, health and safety risk, fire risk, you know, these are all future-based risk that we already comment on. Asbestos is a future-based risk. So why the hell are we not reporting then on other aspects which may have a future-based risk? So we can absolutely discuss it. The only thing that I would say is that we just need to make sure that we are giving it a little bit of context, and so that clients actually understand it. And it's not to frighten the client. We're not there to, you know, necessarily put doubts in their mind. We are there to purely kind of give them the information and advice that we know based on A, what our research is, and B, what we actually see on site as well. I would also add that the Home Survey Standard actually states specifically for risk to occupants that when it comes to things like research and regulation, that these matters may change over time. So I would say even since 2018, you know, the matters have changed over time. So we need to make sure that we're being compliant in that way. So when we think about the approach to reporting, so to ensure we're doing our best for clients, we need to essentially kind of take a macro view and understand its micro impacts. And as a result of that, I would say very much our role is changing. Okay, so if we think our role is changing, then what does that mean in terms of the client, and how do they actually consider kind of climate-focused matters in particular? Okay, so Appendix A of the Home Survey Standard. Anyone remember what Appendix A is all about? Of the Home Survey Standard? Introduction. No, Wayne. It's essentially talking about your benchmarks, right? And specifically what I want to point out is, and look, you may disagree, you may not, feel free to chime in here, but essentially it specifically states that the benchmarks are there to be flexed so that surveyors can essentially innovate and respond to changes in the market. So talking about climate and climate change is absolutely a key way to do that. And from my experience, would actually be putting you a step above the rest, because out of what I see, not many surveyors are doing it at all. So if we consider what's happened over the last 5 to 6 years, then we can see that there have been changes in the market and we need to be aware of them. So I've mentioned a few of them already, so 2018 minimum energy efficiency standards, but also, you know, the UK's enshrinement of law about reaching net zero by 2050, that came in 2019. But also something which is actually, anyone here undertake valuations? Yeah, so in terms of the valuation space and lending, actually, so banks are now actually, they now have to report on climate-related financial disclosures, sorry. So they have to do that. But specifically what I find quite interesting is that mainstream banks, I won't name particulars, but mainstream banks essentially have to, well, I say have to, but their kind of targets are to have a portfolio where 50% of their properties in that portfolio should be an EPC rating or above by 2030. C, yeah, an energy rating on the EPC of C or above by 2030. So that kind of really tells you the shift in the market from the lending space, not just for the fact that there has been definitely an increase in green mortgages in particular. So I want to kind of draw your attention to a couple of reports, which again, I'd really urge everyone here to go and read. So Rightmove. Last year, they released a Green Homes report, which essentially said that green homes, however you might define that, actually achieved a premium, with the average of being almost £56,000 paid more for homes that had been improved from an EPC rating of F up to C. So that's a huge amount of money. Additionally, it said that there were indications, take that kind of description with what you will, but there were indications that tenants were becoming much more interested in energy efficiency. Obviously, because if you think about the kind of outgoing bills on month by month basis, so apparently 1 in 5 tenants were saying that that was going to become a major factor with them actually choosing their next property to live in. Sorry, did I hear a question? No. So additionally to that, apparently 61% of landlords are now not purchasing property which is of an EPC C or below. Okay, I should say D or below, so anything above a C. So really we're seeing a huge shift in what landlords want and what they expect from property, but more importantly, what potentially they're looking at investing in particular. If we come back to minimum energy efficiency standards specifically, I see it written about in reports, but often it's essentially kind of you should be aware of minimum energy efficiency standards. It doesn't actually, they don't often actually explain what that particularly means. Additionally, I should say that a majority of the reports where that has been written actually claim incorrect comments around the regulation as well. So what I'll often see is that say a property is EPC energy rated D, they'll actually then make the statement that that's not compliant with the EPC regulations. But in case you didn't know, it's EPC E or above. Okay, so it would therefore be compliant. But in terms of...
So we're talking about letting standards now?
Yeah, minimum energy efficiency standards, so private rented sector only. But specifically, this is just a viewpoint, but when we're talking about minimum energy efficiency standards, it's my personal opinion that we should be making every single client aware of that particular regulation. Why? Because circumstances change. My circumstances have actually changed. So I bought a property, I now actually want to rent it out. If I bought a property and then 2 years later I realised that it wasn't rentable and I didn't have that option, effectively that asset may potentially become either unrentable or it's actually not worthless, but it doesn't have the opportunity to be used for maybe the means that I want it to. So when we talk about the concept of investors, we often relate that term specifically with people who are looking to buy and let property out. It's my personal opinion that everybody is an investor in property. The reason being is that the majority of the time they are looking at property from a long-term perspective. So we need to make sure that people are aware of regulation right from the outset. Additionally, there was a report done by a law firm called Shakespeare Martineau. I don't know if any of you have heard of it, but essentially that report was saying that 80% of the buyers that they were speaking to throughout the course of however long, they were saying that they were more likely to buy a green home if there were certain kind of features which were incorporated into that property. So specifically, we're talking about energy efficiency, we're talking about renewable technology, but also one of the things that they wanted was actually water efficiency. They wanted electric vehicle charging points and also recycling points. I'm not going to bang on about recycling because it's a really thing close to my heart. Irritates me something chronic. I live in a development and we only have cardboard recycling, which irritates me, and I have to go down to the recycling point and take up my recycling with me to do it. So really frustrating.
Sorry, you just said water efficiency. What do you mean by water efficiency?
So how efficient a property is at delivering water and how good it is at heating it
Like solar
as well.
water?
Yeah, so it might also include obviously things like air source heat pumps as well. I was about to drink out the. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. That was terribly uncouth.
Definitely a surveyor.
So yeah, the other thing to note actually, what I found quite interesting was, you know, even Savills, which obviously typically deals with kind of high levels of the market, whilst people weren't necessarily concerned with the value of property from the outset, 54% of the respondents to a survey, I think, if memory serves me right, it was back in August 2023, they were essentially saying that whilst the value of the property doesn't necessarily matter from the outset, what did matter to them was actually reducing their operational costs, so essentially their outgoings. So if we think about the energy crisis and the cost of living, so I know personally, you know, my energy bills, they were £70, I'm now paying £158. So, you know, that's not unusual, and that is just something that everybody's facing, but even for people kind of in the higher market, seems to be impacting their thought process as well. So thinking about all that, we need to be thinking about clients and giving them right and relevant information, not just based on what they're asking, but actually based on what they need, given kind of fluctuation in market changes, and also professional shifts that we're seeing as well. Very conscious of this. Okay, so in terms of some examples, are there any engineers in the room? Just you? Just you on your lonesome? Okay, so the Institute of Structural Engineers, they've actually declared a climate emergency specifically. Have you actually looked at the sustainability roadmap?
No, because I do more surveying now.
Okay.
So I started out engineering and moved across. So
Sure. Okay, cool. So, absolutely does. So whether you're an engineer or not, if you actually go on the ISE website and have a look at the sustainability roadmap, there's a ton of resources which are still very, very relevant to you in terms of, you know, things that you might need to know relating to sustainability more broadly, but also energy efficiency specifically as well. I've already mentioned Part O already relating to overheating. Did everyone know that Part O was a thing? Okay, cool, as long as that's a good starting point. But also something which you might want to be aware of is actually the proposal of Part Z. Okay, anyone know what Part Z is? No? So Part Z essentially aligns to the whole life cycle carbon assessment from the RICS paper, which actually, yep, got it written on here, becomes effective in July 2024. It's essentially measuring carbon from cradle to grave, so essentially what it takes to build, what it takes when, you know, throughout the operational lifetime, and then what it would take to demolish as well. So it's a whole life cycle approach to carbon, which, okay, doesn't necessarily fit specifically in terms of what surveyors do, but might well kind of impact you at a later date, probably primarily through things like the Future Home Standards, which there has been an interim uplift in terms of Part F and Part L when it comes to ventilation requirements, and also energy efficiency, particularly around new homes, needing to be a 31% reduction in carbon emissions to hit the relevant targets. So there's a lot of things going on which really kind of demonstrate that professional shift. Out of interest, just because I was on the expert working group as well, anyone here read the RICS retrofit standard?
I haven't, but I'm aware of it.
Okay, yeah. Okay, cool. So I found it quite interesting. There was a post on LinkedIn the other day where a surveying company it sounds like they've really kind of gone into the retrofit space. So if you are kind of looking at expanding or thinking about what you might want to do, definitely take a look at it and see, you know, how you might fit into maybe services and delivery around that. Okay. Have I been going 50 minutes already? God, sorry. Okay, so we need to effectively think about home surveys through the lens of the future, and we need to do that by looking at the content of our home surveys in particular, not just from a standards and quality perspective, but also as a means of serving the client with, as I've mentioned, not just what they want, but also what they need as well. Now, I get told by surveyors all the time, someone only wants a survey to tell them that something's wrong with the property. Okay, whilst that might be an underlying reason for somebody actually getting a survey, it doesn't actually stop us or preclude us from exploring what they might want to know, or what might they want need to know, I should say. So just.
Well, they need to know is what's wrong with the property.
Yes, but what do you think then about things like overheating? So it's not necessarily a defect, but it's actually potentially a risk.
That's part of the problem. That's what they need to know.
Yes, but then if that's what they need to know, why aren't surveyors reporting on it?
Well, when someone comes to me, I do.
Oh, okay, great, great.
It seems obvious to me. Like, like they want to know the problem, you tell them the problem.
So, yes, but would you automatically talk about climate change, talk about overheating in your reports?
It's applicable.
Okay, so when is it applicable?
Well, it might be a leak, mightn't it?
Sorry, a leak.
So a problem with the property could be just simply it's got a leak.
Okay, so this interesting comment actually. So when you talk about a leak, so talk me through your process. What do you actually report on?
Well, you can find a leak and say it's leaking there, you need to fix it.
Okay, so how does that? No, that's fine. Can I just answer this
that's
question?
fine.
Just 2 seconds, sorry. But so, in your terms of reporting,
That's right. It's just move on. It's fine.
so just for everyone to kind of think about that particular example. So what you're talking about is that linear approach to reporting. Whereas, if we think about the client, what does a leak actually mean? Well, actually, a dripping tap can equate to 5,000 litres of water loss throughout the course of a year. What does that mean to the client? That's a potential expense. That's a potential cost. Okay? So it's not just about linearly kind of reporting, hey, here's a defect. Let's, point it out. I appreciate what you're saying, but that actually doesn't incorporate the kind of climate-focused occupant or resilience aspect of property.
It does to their bill, because they're charged by the cubic litre, then they'll notice their bill's going up. That's why they just want the tap fixed.
Yes, but did you report it in the report?
No, I'm a chartered building engineer, so I get called in to fix things, not to report and stuff.
Okay, so maybe a slight different.
I've started my life working up as a Royal Navy engineer, so my job is about fixing stuff rather than.
Okay, so surveyor's kind of scope is possibly a little bit different.
Yeah, that's why I said move on.
Yeah, no, I think you've answered that. I was going to say something similar, that I'm a qualified energy assessor and retrofit assessor.
Yep.
And I'd done a lot of work with Winchester City Council, trying to sort a lot of houses out, and it was a complete headache. And now I'm doing level 2s and level 3s, and we talk about energy on a level 3, and I found the same thing, that clients don't care. When I've tried to talk about it or mention it, they don't care. But you've linked it to cost, which maybe if I start doing that, then they might care.
Yeah.
It's like everyone says,
yeah.
It's hard to, talk about these things. They just want to know what's wrong, and
True.
that's it. They don't care about anything else.
Yeah, but they'll care when they move in, and then their bills skyrocket, particularly if they've moved from a 1-bed, 2-bed flat to a 3-bed house, right? This is just a personal kind of family thing, but my sister-in-law, they wanted to move from a 2-bed mid-terrace 1970s home to a 3-bed Victorian semi-detached. Granted, and we'll talk about energy efficiency and EPC specifically in a second, of which you may be better versed, but actually people don't understand how energy performance certificates are actually created and the methodology behind them. So essentially they say, oh, it's an EPC A, boom, job done. What they don't actually relate that to is their personal use specifically. But what you mentioned there is very true, cost, right? People only tend to care about things when it hits their back pocket. Okay, so yeah, maybe take a slightly different approach potentially. So yeah, actually talking about some research that I did 2 years ago, actually, coming back to your particular point, and this was actually, I would say, pre-crunch of the energy crisis. A lot of surveyors that I spoke to actually said to me, well, you know, and clients don't ask me about it. Fine, but when I said to the surveyors, but are you asking the client whether they want to know about it? They said, oh no. And I was thinking, well, if you're not asking them what they want, how do you know what they want and also what they need? So we need to be proactive versus reactive, and just kind of delivering things maybe perhaps the way that we have always done. And I hasten to add, most of my clients have now actually said, since they actually started reporting slightly different and asking their clients different questions, it's become much more relevant to their clientele. Not always, but you know, much more relevant. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually just going to share with you a few examples of how to go about reporting, and you know, what I'm going to show you isn't necessarily mind-blowing, but they are just small things that you can do, which are super easy to implement. Okay, that can actually help elevate your report above other reports that are delivered in the sector, and hopefully will provide the client with just that little bit more information and advice in particular. So we've spoken about energy efficiency, definitely obviously a hot topic as a result of energy costs, and it's really important that clients are told the information that they need to know, but also that we actually comply with the Home Survey Standard. Who here reports the environmental impact rating? Yay! Yay! Okay, so most of the surveys that I read initially don't actually comment on the environmental impact rating. The reason being is that they've actually missed this kind of extract from the Home Survey Standard. So we've got in an EPC, so you've got your energy rating and you've also got the environmental impact rating. A lot of surveyors say to me, well, the environmental impact rating isn't there anymore. That's not the case. Heading 5, just look down the page. So that was the bit that apparently I was really angry at. So hopefully I've improved there. So in terms of energy performance certificates and actually reporting, by even just making that small change, it's not even about, you know, delivering high quality or delivering what a customer might need to know. It's actually just about complying with the standard at this point. By doing that, that you will comply. Okay, so this is essentially just a breakdown of what I've just shown you. So in terms of the Home Survey Standard, there are other standards out there which don't necessarily have this level of detail, but I can certainly talk to you about them if you want. But when we're talking about level 1, so effectively all you have to do is review and state the ratings. Level 2, you're talking about any discrepancies that you might have seen and any implications that might have been caused as a result, or could be caused. And then level 3 is specifically around your advice in particular. Now, just as a kind of general review, sorry, this is incorrect, so that should say energy efficiency rating, so EER. So what you may or may not know, hopefully you do, is that when we're talking about the energy rating, that's actually based on cost. Okay, so specifically it's a rating based on the performance of the building and the services that are included within it. So typically, the higher the rating, obviously the more costly the fuel bills will be. But again, just to reiterate, this is based on a set of assumptions and won't be specific to that client that you're actually talking to. And the same is true of carbon dioxide emissions. So again, you've got the A to G rating, and obviously the higher the rating, the less of the impact on the environment in particular. So how can we report? Another thing that I get told by surveyors is, well, the RICS template, so does anyone here have a license for the RICS template? at all? Yeah, so a lot of you. Most people will say to me, well, there's not a box for the environmental impact rating. Okay, that's fine, but you can see here, obviously you can put essentially your energy rating in the top one, and then you've got these two boxes here. So issues relating to the energy efficiency rating, and then other energy matters. So just for clarity, the template cannot make you compliant. Okay, the content of your report makes you compliant. So in order to be compliant in terms of that energy matters perspective, you need to make sure that you are doing that. Okay, so I don't know why I made up squirrel close, just sounded cute to me. But so in terms of the improvement, okay, on that, so rather than necessarily just reporting on the rating, so we're talking more about level 2 potentially here, but it's really about saying how that particular rating relates to other property. So again, these are based on a set of assumptions. But if we look at the EPC, your average rating for an EPC is a D. Okay, I think specifically it's 60 as a rating. So if one is, say, for example, C76, then that's actually better than your average EPC, which is actually quite just a nice thing to know, right? Because you have an understanding about how it correlates with energy performance certificates. And the same is true of environmental impact ratings as well. So there's quite a lot on this page. You do have the handouts, so please feel free to read them. But essentially this is kind of talking about level 2 and level 3 based on this kind of framework here, so that circular approach to reporting. So what you can see here is actually just a little bit of context with relation to what the EPC actually means. So what we've put here is, and also make sure that you are specific around what rating you're referring to, specifically the energy rating is X, Y, or Z, which is better than an average D rating. But then make sure that you actually put that those ratings are based on a set of assumptions, so it won't accurately reflect your usage. Okay, so then people actually understand, well, hang on, so if I've got an electric boiler and now I whack that on for 8 hours of the day throughout the winter, that's going to cost me a hell of a lot more money than perhaps this EPC will be reflective of, as an example, particularly if they've actually transitioned from a gas boiler to an electric boiler in particular. Additionally, when we're talking about level 2, something which I don't see is the clarification of looking at discrepancies. How am I doing for time?
You're fine, you've got 10 minutes.
Okay, all right. So when we talk about discrepancies, so Home Survey Standards requires that level 2 talks about any discrepancies found and the implications of them. So there's no harm in saying no obvious discrepancies were seen, right? So obviously you can think about what obvious might mean, but if you say got 100 mil of insulation on the EPC, but you've actually seen 270 mil or vice versa, then that might actually have an impact, as an example. Additionally, I've put the example here of an electric boiler. So if electricity is much more costly, typically it's about three times more expensive than gas, then obviously that's going to potentially impact on the energy performance certificate if they were to renew that. And then if we come on to level 3, so level 3 is really talking about the recommendations, and something that I don't often see is actually specific commentary relating, again, coming back to this kind of circular approach, so climate occupants resilience. What I don't often see is commentary around kind of exposed areas. So where a property, so in this example, where a property is exposed to high levels of wind-driven rain, condition of the walls will obviously deteriorate more rapidly than sheltered areas. And then aspects relating to internal wall insulation, cavity wall insulation. So you're not even necessarily giving, advice. You're actually just giving information and just providing a little bit of context of how these particular recommendations might interact with that particular site. So again, I come come at it from the point of view of let's think kind of more macro and then delve into how that actually impacts on the site itself. Additionally, if we think about solar panels as a recommendation, so okay, I often read surveys which say, you know, there's a recommendation for a solar panel, but what I don't actually hear about is, okay, well, is the property south-facing? Is it has it got you know, is there a massive tree right outside the property which is going to impact on things like shading? So there might be a recommendation, but how useful is it for that particular property? From a kind of fabric perspective, also think about obviously if a roof actually might need strengthening. So it might be that you've had, you know, we're going to hear about roofs later, but you might have a traditional kind of cut timber roof which has had concrete tiles placed on it, obviously causing a greater weight to be put on the property, but maybe there's no additional support that's been given for that, and then you're going to plough on solar panels. So you might need to think about what the impact of that would be in that regard as well. If you do kind of mentally prefer kind of linear-based thinking, then you might like to think EPC reporting specifically, I'm talking about here, in this kind of way. So you're reviewing the EPC, you're actually looking to see if there are any issues. When we come to this bit, impact, it's not just impact on the property, it's impact on the client as well. Okay, and then obviously talking about your advice. Okay, flooding. Yeah, I've probably said this a million times to people. Low risk. Okay, that's typically what I find in home surveys, is the properties in a low risk flood area. Whilst that might be the case, what we're not actually doing here is being specific about the particular type of risk. Sorry, the source of the risk. So if we think about this particular property, can't remember where I was looking at, maybe somewhere in St Albans, London, West London, I think. So this actually shows that there are different risk allocations based on the source. Okay, so you might have surface water risk as low risk, and then you might have rivers and seas as very low. Okay, if you have flooding and you have surface water flooding and the banks break to a river or whatever, then actually that's going to be a cumulative effect. Okay, so you should be reporting on these more specifically. So specifically saying, you know, the property is in a low risk area of surface water flooding, as an example. So this is an impact. Is an example. And specifically, what I often miss is this. Okay, risk is very subjective. Okay, my risk of things like radon might be, you know, much different to Ramon, yours. You know, people think and perceive risk very differently, but if we provide them with a few statistics, they can actually understand what that means. So when we talk about low risk, that actually means, low risk. So we're talking about 0.1 to 1% chance of flooding every single year. So at least we've kind of categorised and contextualised that risk, particularly for clients. And then also we want to be making sure that we're actually talking about site impacts. So again, kind of bringing macro to micro. So if the property is at the bottom of a hill, that might be much more problematic. It might be in a low risk area, but if the property is at the bottom of a hill, there still might be some element of history of flooding or what have you, which comes back to obviously vendor inquiries that we should be making as well. Or there might be a sloping driveway that goes toward the property rather than away, and maybe there's no echo drain as well. Okay, so there could be these risks on top of that, and we need to make sure that we're not just giving them the risk, we're actually talking about the site impacts of those risks specifically as well. Almost at the end, guys. Okay, kind of ignore this bit, less perhaps relevant for today. That's more kind of sustainability focused as a broader concept. But if we're talking about climate and climate change, Some other areas which we can improve in terms of our reporting. Well, talking about heat loss, okay? I think I'm right in saying I have only ever read 2 home survey reports that actually comment in terms of that language and talk about heat loss. Now, I find that remarkable because heat loss is something that everybody can understand, right? When we talk about U values, you know, thermal conductivity, thermal resistance, people don't understand that language, but what people do understand is heat loss. So these are things which we can bring into context for people. So talking about, you know, your average heat loss through particular elements, so whether that be walls, floors, windows, or what have you. Also, I thought you were going to talk about microgeneration earlier, but we missed it. But specifically, I know last time, I think, Wayne, at one of the conferences I was at with you, a lot of surveyors didn't know what MCS was. How many here know what MCS is? Okay, so only a few. So MCS is the Microgeneration Certification Scheme. It essentially is a standards setting scheme. And what's important about it is that in order to access the Smart Export Guarantee, so say you have solar panels on your roof, to access the Smart Export Guarantee, you have to have an MCS certification, thank you, or equivalent. Okay, so I mean, it's interesting. Like my mother-in-law, so she moved into this new build property. She's got solar panels. I kid you not, she doesn't know whether they're working. You know, she doesn't actually know if they're exporting anything. She doesn't even know if she's at the Smart Export Guarantee. Like, there's so little information that's given to people, and we really need to help them be armed with the right information and the relevant advice, not just for, you know, what we see on the date of inspection, but also actually what we see in the future.
The MCS certification, is that a government?
Like endorsed?
Yeah, or is it not? I don't think it is, but you can correct me if I'm wrong.
That's a good question.
It's a draw funding. It's also draw funding.
A second?
You also have to have MCS accreditation if you're going to get grant funding.
Yes. So specifically, if you're doing like retrofit projects with grant-funded property, they have to be MCS funding. So I would be inclined to say it's government endorsed, but don't quote me on that. I can't remember. Okay, so that. I think that essentially kind of brings me to the end. I mean, I really hope that the kind of circular approach and what I've spoken to you about today might actually just help you think about how you might just shift your reporting ever so slightly for home surveys. But just from my perspective, and I hope everyone's, like, we have an opportunity here to help tackle climate change and also to actually help drive the value of surveyors and what we actually do. And so, you know, we can help to support net zero ambitions, we can help drive more sustainable and resilient housing and a better future for all. Thank you.
Okay, we're about spot on time, so...
So, very quick question. I want to wait to the end. So, you talked about data in terms of energy, in terms of heat loss there, in terms of flooding. They all have a number that you can help the client understand what the impact is of doing something or nothing.
Yes.
Yeah? But you opened up at the beginning with regards to climate change. I think let's just recognise it. Climate is always changing. And you talked about rainfall and temperature, effect soil heat, etc., etc. Is there any modelling that's been done by, I think, probably more relevant areas of the country and particular soil types, specifically, because some of them more than others, that could help us speak more quantitatively rather than qualitatively? Climate change is, you know, you're living on you're living on clay soil. It's going to heave, man. You know, let's be more specific.
No, I'm sorry, I wasn't mocking you. I just loved it.
Yeah. We can frighten people off.
Is it exactly?
Or we can be really specific about how important something actually is.
Yeah, I understand that. So I don't have the figures on me, but specifically I would actually look at subsidence-based claims on insurance because they have increased, particularly from last year. So yeah, definitely take a look at the links. I'll have a ganders over lunch and see if I can find it.
Is anyone in the Environment Agency or anyone else British Geographical Society, anyone else has done, that you're aware of, that we can go and have a look at?
BGS, they have got content on their website relating to those issues, particularly around insurance. I can't remember if they've actually done their own kind of particular paper or not on it. I'm not 100% sure, but certainly, yeah, certainly go and take a look, because I do appreciate what you're saying. It's not. That's why why hopefully I've said really try and give context, because we don't want to, we're not there to lead the market and say, oh, don't buy this property because there's a risk it might, suffer from ground movement. That's not the point. But what we're trying to do is just at least bring that understanding. Just as an example, I hope you don't mind, Jojo, but very quickly, in Wales, a surveyor commented on something a few weeks ago, and essentially one of their clients found out from the survey that the property was in a high flood risk area, and they actually put the purchase on hold to investigate that more. So that was in Wales, and I actually my family lived very close to an area which suffered from mudslides. So it is, yes, it might be regional, but actually at least if we're talking about it more generally, we can make people more aware as well.